Welcome to video 2 in our course on B09 Introduction to um, R for AI, and we're now going to look at types of AI methods. So AI methods kind of there's a huge amount, and these are ones that kind of try to mimic human intelligence and try to therefore support decision making, analysis, optimization, and so on. AI is a um, includes machine learning, and therefore we shouldn't talk about machine learning and AI. Machine learning is part of AI. Machine learning has is more specific in terms of having methods to learn features and make decisions about data. This does not require necessarily direct human commands, mainly human guidance. And what we're going to look at in our lab later is a very structured and explicit approach to running AI things. Um, An example of AI methods is reinforcement learning, where an agent learns to make decisions by implementing actions that are rewarded or penalized based on output. And that's just one example of an AI method. We're going to talk about supervised and unsupervised learning, which is mentioned in the course SC9 exploratory data analysis already. Supervised learning, we have a data with known labels or groups specified in advance, whereas in unsupervised, we do not. And as you know from that previous course, we can use both these methods in the same analysis. Unsupervised modeling is very effective for identifying to perform quality control in our data set. So we can use that for data exploration to check that it looks okay and our samples are correct. Um, and then what's different about them is unsupervised learning tries to maximize the fraction of feature variation explained by the components that are selected, whereas supervised learning is trying to identify the K components, maximizing the differences between groups. So it's looking for features that differentiate, whereas unsupervised is looking simply features that explain the total variation that's present. So with supervised learning, what we're going to do later is develop models based on training data and use that training data to create a model that is then tested on testing data to assess how good it is. And that testing data can be used then to consider whether our model is actually good or not good. Also, another option is semi-supervised learning, where the data has some labeled data and some unlabeled data, where it's used to learn. The labeled data is used to learn basic patterns, such as an example here, where we've a bunch of fruit, which is our unlabeled data, and we have labels for banana and oranges. So we kind of develop a model that can assist us in identifying unlabeled data that is neither an apple nor an orange, but is something else, so that we can navigate data sets that have some prior information, but not necessarily a whole lot. So let's think about other methods. So we have our unsupervised model, which can be where we might be using some sort of dimension reduction technique like principal components analysis or multidimensional scaling, TSNE, UMAP, NMF, techniques that we mentioned in the previous course. If we're using clustering, we might be using something like k-means clustering or hierarchical clustering to allocate the different samples into groups. If we're trying to predict using a supervised model, we have a slightly different approach. If we have continuous data, we might try linear regression, which is what we're going to try later. And there's many different types of that. Whereas if we have discrete data, we're effectively using logistic regression, again, to try to categorize the groups using some sort of decision-based system, which could be tree-based, random forest, gradient boosting, and so on. Other methods. Deep learning is a type of machine learning using neural networks where we have certain hidden layers that are far greater than is typical from machine learning methods that allows more complex patterns to be inferred. So you can imagine here we might have many hidden layers that allow more sensitive models to be explored. This does require a substantially higher level of computing to achieve this, and therefore has to be used where the data is actually efficient for this. This can use labeled or unlabeled data, and even with access to GPU computing, it still takes a long time to do. Other methods, um, we can now, or we're in a position with foundation models to use pre-trained models that built on using related data. So, for example, if you're trying to identify features in biological images and you have some sort of obscure experimental context, you may be able to use existing models that have been trained on similar images that are, maybe in the same genus as your ones that actually can be quite effective for your models. So there's also options there. So here we see the difference between deep learning tries to automate all these processes of feature extraction and classification and so on to classify items in this instance, whereas your typical machine learning approach requires human intervention to do this feature extraction and to identify what do you want to actually look at in this data. So um, there's pros and cons to both methods because if we use a deep learning model, we might ask ourselves what differentiates a car from not car? And with deep learning, that's going to be hard to figure out. With machine learning, we may be in a better position to actually say are cars different from not cars? That can be biologically more relevant. Other examples um, use artificial neural networks, and that's for the inspiration for deep learning, where it's trying to mimic the human brain by having many hidden layers. Um, an example of this is voice recognition, where you might have a lot of data and a certain consistent patterns, but then also some nuances. So this is very powerful, but it's unclear a model basis for differentiating between cars and not cars. You need a lot of data for this. You're talking about millions of data. An example of this is our convolutional neural networks, which can be very effective at image and spatial analysis. For example, here we might have a image of different cells where we want to differentiate platelets from white blood cells from red blood cells, and further into other cell types within those different categories. So they're very good at image recognition or object detection. Um, Related to this is image detection using these foundation models that are working on pre-trained data, known as you only look once. So simply, we're not trying to train a model on our own images. We're trying to use the existing models that are already trained to uh, simultaneously identify all the objects in the image so that rather than the typical methods which identify a part of it as being a particular image and use that information to infer the other parts as well. An example where we could apply this, where we're trying to look at time series analysis, we might be looking at a time course for an experiment where we have African swine fever, ASFV, um, trying to uh, uh, infect host cells, and we might look at that over time to see what happens during this experiment and use um, neural networks to decode the infection process and try to identify patterns um, of infection in terms of the spatial orientation of the different virus particles and their adhesion to cells and so on. Some of these can use long-term, short-term memory networks, which use a recurrent neural networks to infer long-range dependencies in time series data. Other ones are you are aware of linked to generative AI. So we have discriminative AI, which is like regression and neural network classifiers, and that's different from generative AI, where we're trying to create something. So discriminative AI, which you talked about already, it performs analysis, whereas generative AI is different. So if you think about discriminative AI, we're trying to predict Y given X, whereas with generative AI, it's a type of deep learning. So it's very time consuming. We're trying to learn the joint distribution of X and Y. And think of YOLO image detection is trying to identify the set of items in an image at the same time. So it's not a conditional set of probabilities based on the image for the different parts of the image. It's doing it all at the same time. And we can infer the probability of Y given X retrospectively using Bayesian approaches on that basis. And this allows us to transform our image into something new. So we're generative, we're creating something new. An example of this is LLMs, which are a type of AI, and they can take input images, transform them in some sort of way using an encoder, and those transformed images can be decoded to reconstruct the same original image. There's lots of different types of autoencoders, one of which is variational or autoencoders, which are neural networks that learn from the data, for example, for quality control. And there's different theoretical bases for these different approaches. An example of this is where we want to example infer from a single image what are the most likely set of fe images that might be similar to this one if we had the same image at a different angle. And can we map on data from one thing to another, such as zebras and horses here? So these are a type of generative AI, as generative adversarial networks. And these are very good for simulation and development and so on. Uh, Other examples are regression. So that's looking at discriminative AI. We're looking at predicting continuous development, continuous variable, using something like ordinary least squares. So, for example, we might have a question over, does this item have feathers? Um, if it has feathers, can it fly? Um, if it is if it has feathers and can fly, therefore it's more likely to be a hawk, whereas if not, then it's a penguin. If it does not have feathers and has fins, maybe it's a dolphin. Whereas if it lacks feathers and lacks fins, then maybe it's a bear. So regression kind of allows us to categorize the objects and um, make decisions over the data that is present. Other types of regression um, link our variable y and tries to model that based on X and other variables, and there's many approaches that which that or like ordinary squared, LOS, um, smoothers, ANOVA, and so on. We also have variations like moving from polynomial, moving from simple regression to polynomial regression, where you can have other variables that are inside there that may have more complex relationship, but our default should always start with linear regression and to see how that works. We may also have well, we will look at examples later where we looked at ordinary squares to extract information just using simple linear regression in R using the LM function, whereas some sort of model like this, we have some sort of intercept that is the baseline for our observation Y, which might have a particular feature I, and that feature I is a particular um, variable X that may contribute to it, depending on the magnitude of the effect in beta 1 and beta 2, and so on and so on, all the way through the different variables the different features that may impact Y. And there's many other types of linear regression, like regulars linear regression, where it's like ordinary squares above, but has a penalty to remove predictors or ones where to remove them or shrink their coefficients beta 1, 2, 3, 4 to 0 because just including more variables is not necessarily an optimal way of modeling something. And there's different basis approaches for that. There's also more complex types of regression like support vector regression that tries to get the optimal plane, 2D plane, to split data into two or more groups and maximizing the distance between the groups. So imagine you have high dimensional space. This tries to split the data across a certain plane here, shown by this line, and tries to divide it into different groups. Um, there's also different types of classification methods. So we may want to classify our groups in our samples into groups based on features. Um, you can have a naive based classifier, for example, for text analysis. Logistic regression allows us to model binary choices, such as the membership of a sample to a particular group. And then also SVM, support vector machines, and other tools can be effective for a range of things, including outlier detection. And then random forest is a very common ensemble method for classifying data in two or more groups. So what we want to do if we're doing natural language processing is try to analyze or make human data based on labeled data. So when machine translation allows us to translate between different languages That's an example of it. We might have named entity recognition, identifying key information from a document like names, dates, locations, and so on. We have text classification that may analyze large amounts of text and allocate those documents into different groups. Um, and there's many other related methods like sentiment analysis and speech recognition that link to this as well. If we're thinking about unsupervised clustering, links to what we talked about before in terms of dimension reduction, and that can be grouping samples into similar groups based on their intrinsic features. So we may have, for example, different species of mice that have different lengths. Gaussian mixture models can do this, where they can consider um, our observations as a set of mixtures, allowing us to model them effectively. And then we can, for example, after that, apply something like hierarchical clustering to make a series of tree-like splits of the nested clustered groups. Another example of that is k-means clustering, where unlike hierarchical clustering, where it's trying to split at every bifurcation in the tree, this might have a particular number k into which we want to split our groups. So if k is 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, we might get a different result. Other examples of unsupervised clustering include self-organized maps. These are artificial neural networks to reduce the number of dimensions that are present. And there's other ones that are effective at this as well. We mentioned variational audio encoders before. They can be used for dimension reduction. LDA, linear discriminant analysis, is also effective for dimension reduction in terms of maximizing the differences between labeled groups. PCA we mentioned before, TSNE we mentioned before for linear effects, and UMAP as well. And we also mentioned reinforcement learning at the start, where we have an agent that tries to um, improve the model based on the level of rewards that are present. It's an iterative model with steps, similar to an author-critic models where you estimate a value and determine whether you should try to complete an existing task or take a new option. There's also other options within that, like Monte Carlo tree searches, where um, there's a tree search approach. Um, for example, you might want to identify what are the optimal time points on which to do quality control checks on a particular in a particular experiment. And there's many others there. And this is kind of gives you a sense of the extent to which these are interpretable. So when we do linear regression, it's quite easy to interpret it. The extent to which it's accurate over large data sets is questionable. At the other end, SEMs can be sometimes difficult to figure out what is the biological meaning or mechanism behind something, but their accuracy may be higher. And therefore, there's kind of a trade-off between these two areas. And you can see why people random forest is a popular method, because it has reasonable interpretability and it can be accurate for certain methods. So this is a tricky point. So that completes this video on the types of AI methods. Please look at the next video on getting data and exploratory data analysis.